Pred nami pa je še zadnji govorec, zadnji, ki bo danes delil svoje izkušnje, svoje znanje z nami. In sicer ga bomo poskušali priklicati in povezati preko Skypa. Namreč gre za izkušenega profesorja, ki je doktoriral iz molekularne biologije in biokemije na City University v New Yorku. Je ena vodilnih avtoritet na področju uporabe kanabinoidov za terapevtske namene. Je avtor številnih znanstvenih publikacij, predavatelj ter strokovni član številnih združenj in fondacij. Hkrati je izredni profesor na oddelku za biologijo na Univerzi v Koloradu in je tudi predsednik in direktor ZDA Cannabis Science združbe. Mislim, da smo pripravljeni na to, da ga povežemo in pozdravimo. Takole, preko Skypa, žal ne more in takole. Dajmo en velik aplauz doktorju Robertu J. Melamedu.
Yeah, can you see my presentation? Okay. So you tell me when I should start. I should start. Okay. All right. Well, I'm so thankful to be sort of there. Unfortunately, because I had gotten sick and was hospitalized with a heart problem, I am not flying for a while. So I'm very glad that we're able to do this via Skype. And what I want to do is I want to provide a good scientific foundation for all of the miraculous and interesting things that you've been hearing from the earlier presenters. I've always been very pathological about trying to understand things. And my whole life, what I wanted to understand was what life is. And it turns out that my mother was right. God is Mother Nature. And what I would like to do is explain some little taught science to you regarding a physics that provides a fundamental understanding of the nature of how life came about and how evolution occurs and the very unique role that the endocannabinoid system plays in particular in all vertebrates that happen to have cannabinoid receptors. So this is a general outline, it's not complete, of the kinds of things we're going to be talking about. So we'll start off with the physics of life, and I hope you can put up with me a little, because for a while we will not really be talking about cannabinoids, but we'll see how once we understand what life is and how the endocannabinoid, how and why the endocannabinoid system evolved, it'll give us I feel, a profound understanding of how cannabis is able to accomplish so many different things, all under the same umbrella, really, of protecting us and doing so in particular by modulating the effects of free radicals. We're going to look at how aging is, in fact, we can look at the physics of aging and what's going on there and the unique role that the cannabinoids play as anti-aging compounds. And then among the various age-related illnesses, we have cancer. And thanks to the wonderful work and insights of Rick Simpson, we're able to utilize this compound and in conjunction with this collection of compounds, in conjunction with the tremendous amount of science that has occurred over the years that can now be integrated into a very holistic perspective. That's one of the main characteristics of life, it's holistic. And that's why cannabis has such magical properties. Not only does it have so many magical compounds, but it plugs in a very multi-dimensional fashion into our very nature. And I want to make sure and go over something that was discovered by Janet Sweeney, who runs the Phoenix Tears Foundation, whereby you can completely modulate the effects, in particular the negative effects of high doses of cannabis via, oh, that's a misspelling there, that should not be, well, what I want to talk about is a compound called acetylcholine that modulates acetylcholine, and we'll go into that later on. And then I want to end with an understanding of how the cannabinoid system in different levels are natural in a population, but that there are real consequences to the fact that we have people with higher levels of cannabinoid activity in modulating certain aspects of our behavior and our consciousness, and how that affects society, and ultimately how it's going to affect our very survival. So we're going to cover quite a spectrum of things, and be patient with me with the beginning. It's very, very important. I teach all of this in my classes. I teach one of the only classes, perhaps the only class in the world, on endocannabinoids and medical marijuana. I've taught that since 2002. I also teach a course on aging, a course on immunology, a course on DNA repair. And they all are taught with the central theme of the physics of life that I'm going to now begin. So in order to fully appreciate the potential of cannabis medicines, we really do have to understand what life is. And we'll see that there's something very special about the cannabinoid system and how the plant is able to tap into it. We're going to be looking at a field of physics called far from equilibrium thermodynamics. Don't be frightened by the name. Far from equilibrium just basically means something has energy that can be used, and thermodynamics is the flow of energy. Well, if you don't have energy that can be used, then you don't have flow, and flow is what is characteristic of all living systems. We have to eat, we have to breathe, we have to burn our food, and we have to get rid of our waste. And there are certain things that happen in that process that happen whether you're a bacteria or a human being or anything in between. So one of the key concepts is that flowing energy organizes matter, and that when matter gets organized by virtue of that flow, we find that there's always oscillations occurring where you have basically a channel that things go back and forth within the limits of that channel. And shifting those limits in a very holistic fashion is a very unique property that the cannabis plant can offer mankind. So what I want to do is integrate this physics and see how that led to the cannabinoid system. This physics was developed by Dr. Ilija Prigogin. He's a Nobel laureate, got his Nobel Prize in 1977. He died about 4 years ago. And he's probably, in my opinion, the smartest man that ever lived. So this is a quote that he liked. It was not a quote from him. The more deeply we study the nature of time, the better we understand that duration means invention, creation of forms, continuous elaboration of the absolutely new. In other words, we're on an evolving planet, and life is continuously evolving, and ideally we as individuals should be continuously evolving, and doing so in a fashion that's consistent with the nature that created us. It doesn't make sense to do things that go against Mother Nature. We have to conform, essentially, and the confirmation in this case means discovery and invention and newness. So this brings up another quote, this one from Ilija Prigogin. We are actually the children of the arrow of time, of evolution, not its progenitors. And the reason this is a very important statement is because conventional physics, whether you're talking about thermodynamics, statistical mechanics, quantum theory, intrinsic in what's really Newtonian physics, even as extended by quantum theory, there's the reversibility of time. Now, that tends to be, from a practical point of view, largely ridiculous. How many of us are getting younger? How many times have you driven your car and had your gas tank fill up instead of deplete? there is an arrow to time. And the way conventional physics is taught, and the basis of conventional physics is this reversibility of time, which really has very little reality in our world. And what Ilija Prigogin did was he created a whole new field of physics, and in that field there is an arrow of time, and in fact time only occurs when you can have energy flow and change occur. So this is an example, a physical example of the phenomena that can be explained and understood through the concept that he developed. What you're seeing here is a petri dish that has about 10 mLs of an oil in it. And 10 mLs is about, 10 to the 20 molecules, 10 to the 21 molecules. It's, billions and trillions of molecules. And what you're seeing in this petri dish is that this liquid has taken on structure. Now, this is something that conventional physics says is impossible to occur. And yet you can do this experiment repeatedly, and what you see is that the liquid has formed hexagonal convection cells. What you're seeing here, if you were to turn this on its side, you would see that the liquid is rising from below, the heat is from below, and the hot molecules are coming up, giving up their heat on the surface, and then the cooled molecules are going back down that center. So what you're essentially having is like a little bucket brigade of organized molecules that are able to better transfer the heat. So these are called hexagonal convection cells, and they're completely statistically improbable. If you were to just take a liquid, pour it into this petri dish, you would never see this happen. It's only because of flowing heat that allows for this organization to spontaneously occur. And it doesn't happen with an in-between step. The molecules, when you heat a liquid, the only thing that conventional physics tells us is that they're going to rotate more, vibrate more, and move faster. And if you had a chemical reaction, that chemical reaction would also occur faster. In this case, there's no chemical reaction. So what we're seeing here is really something very new in terms of the kind of thinking that's required for us to understand what's going on. There's something known as the Second Law of Thermodynamics. And what that says is that entropy, which is a measure of disorder, must always increase. However, in a more accurate statement, it must always increase in a closed system. In other words, if you had a container and it was isolated from the outside, the only thing that can happen is the ball can run down the hill. It's not going to ever roll up the hill. Like the gas tank is not going to fill on its own. So what I want to do, in this particular situation, the reason that this organization is thermodynamically feasible, meaning that it conforms to the second law, even though what you're looking at is organized, is because it makes disorder to the universe increase. In other words, the collective molecules that we're looking at get smarter as long as the universe, the surroundings, the environment gets stupider quicker. So now I want to take to a chemical level that in fact is very representative of what occurs in all living systems. So here we have a reaction known as the Belousov-Zhabotinsky reaction. And what you're looking at again is a petri dish that has a liquid in it. But again, what you're seeing is structure, organization within a liquid, something again that's completely improbable from static point of view. In other words, just pouring the molecules in, didn't have something else happening, you would never see this organization. And what in this case is happening is what's known as a redox reaction. Electrons are being passed from a place that has them and wants to get rid of them to a place that doesn't have them and wants to get them. And this is a direct analogy with life in that we eat food that has reduced hydrocarbons, just the same as the oil and gas has energy in it by virtue of having hydrogens and electrons forced onto carbon molecules that can then be liberated and in doing so, free energy up. So we have a chemical reaction here, an inorganic, non-living chemical reaction, and in that reaction is an indicator, a chemical that changes color depending on whether it's reduced or oxidized. So what you're seeing is in this liquid, the molecules are not randomly distributed, but rather organized into these patterns, because by forming these patterns, they're able to make the universe stupider quicker. So again, impossible, but yet not. And when Zhabotinsky first discovered this, a Russian chemist, back in the 1950s, and he went to publish it, the narrow-minded editors of the journal said, no, we can't publish this because it goes against the second law of thermodynamics. And Belazov followed up with this, and eventually the action mechanism was discovered back in the 60s, and now we understand exactly how the chemistry is occurring, but again, it's occurring within the principle that by forming these patterns, the potential that's stored in chemistry is able to be degraded more rapidly. In other words, the battery discharges faster by forming those patterns than if it doesn't form those patterns. So here you see an example of that happening in real time in this movie. Hang on a second there. So you can see organization occurring as the chemistry works. So again, statistically, from a throwing the dice point of view, this is impossible. But from a flowing energy point of view, it's necessary. And what that's telling us is that life is necessary. Life is not so improbable as to not occur. It's something that must occur by virtue of the fact that we have sunlight irradiating the earth, creating a differential, a flow, and the fact that the earth has its own heat source and chemistry happening as well. You know, the magma and the volcanoes and all of those things have created chemistry. Prior to the existence of life, we had geological chemistry occurring. And what I'm suggesting as an outcome of Prigogin's work, what happened in evolution, really, prebiotic evolution, is that we formed these kinds of structures, and they eventually became so complicated that a phase change occurred. A phase change is a nonlinear rearrangement of molecules, like ice to water, water to steam. In this case, instead of just being driven by a temperature, it's driven by the chemistry. So what I'm going to show you now is a test tube where I'm performing the reaction, and you can see it's clearly well mixed. Those molecules are fully random. And what you're going to see is a color change occurring on the bottom of the tube and then moving up the tube and disappearing and then reappearing again. So there it goes, moves up the tube, disappears, and it'll come back and do it again. And as long as that chemistry has energy left to happen, that reaction will continue to happen. And this, what you're seeing here are two special things. On the one hand, you're seeing organization in space, and on the other hand, you're seeing organization in time. The periodicity that you see of the reaction coming and going. Oscillations, like you see in that reaction, are a fundamental property of all life. We breathe in, we breathe out, our heart contracts and relaxes. We have EEGs in our brain, we have EKGs in our heart. And what I'm going to show you are some other examples of organization like that that occurs on a subcellular level within our cells. So that within our cells, the flowing chemistry, the flowing biochemistry creates the same kind of organizational patterns that I've just demonstrated to you with inorganic molecules. So this was an early experiment done in the 1980s. I think this one was Benno Hess. I forgot. I don't unfortunately have the reference there. What you're looking at here are a variety of chemical compounds that are involved in energy production. And you see that some of them are exactly out of phase with other ones. So glucose 6-phosphate, fructose 6-phosphate, the pH, the acidity, the compounds are oscillating. And then you see other compounds that are oscillating out of phase. Here we see a bunch of molecules, ADP, AMP, NADH. These are molecules that when they get activated, like they are here, ATP, are energy sources. So you're seeing, again, oscillations, and you know, these are all normalized so that they have the same height. But in reality, the quantities of these things are drastically different. But nevertheless, the oscillation periodicity is in fact the same. So you see nice ordered sine waves there. And what I want to do now is take you to something that's a little more complicated. But if you took the last picture and you turned it on its side, so you were looking down this way, and if you look when a reaction first started, like the reactions I earlier showed you, you would see a pattern like this, where you're having a substrate, something that can react, turn into a product, and typically it would be occurring by virtue of the various enzymes that we make that are coded for by our DNA and that are made out of proteins, and have properties called allosterism. Different things regulate their rate, and also they're capable of what we call post-translational modifications, chemical reactions that occur on proteins to modify their activity. And what you're seeing here is that you can start at a particular place, but over time, it'll settle in on that dark band. And you can start at another place, and it'll over time settle in on that dark band. That dark band is equivalent to looking at this from the side. The reason this is so important is that all of our chemistry is forming, or our biochemistry is forming these kinds of organized structures. This is the essence of life, having these relationships. And you might see that if you were looking at a particular biochemical pathway, that this might be a healthy situation, whereas if we shifted it up here, it might be an unhealthy situation. So it's the relationships of our genetics and our environment that regulate how the energy flows and the nature of the oscillations and patterns that we're going to experience. For example, epilepsy, obviously there's a number of improper brain oscillations, and we've clearly been shown how cannabinoids, and in particular cannabidiol, can regulate that. Essentially what it's doing is shifting the relationships that are creating these organized patterns of flow that are essentially similar to the patterns I showed you earlier. So what you wind up having always is a dynamic balance of opposites, where we're always synthesizing things and we're always degrading things. And as we age, some of our fundamental properties dramatically change. For example, everybody knows that a good healthy child heals amazingly quickly, and that a good healthy child is growing both physically and mentally. Well, what happens when we reach adulthood? We start degrading at a greater rate than we were when we were synthesizing at a greater rate. In other words, childhood is moving us further from equilibrium. It's charging the biochemistry of life. Once we age, we start to discharge the battery of life, eventually reaching a point where the system is not generating enough disorganization to the universe to maintain the organization of the system. We undergo another phase change at that point. It's called death. And we are all suffering from a common biochemical imbalance because we're all aging. So we'll see how the cannabinoid system, let me go back there, I screwed up. Come on, get back. All right. We'll see how with aging, what we wind up doing is moving the system closer to equilibrium. Those limit cycles, what we would like to be able to do is have a coordinated effect on our biochemical behavior to keep us further from equilibrium, keep our batteries of life charged up rather than discharging them more rapidly. And the best way to do that is to understand the nature of life and to try to, through our consciousness and feedback, modify our behavior both as individuals and how we as individuals interact, because one of the basic principles of Prigogin's work is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So if we were to disassociate us into our molecules and then throw them out, you know, like a big dye tumbler, we would never create life again. Life is built on this time-dependent progression and continuous evolution of the living systems. We want to be able to become consistent with that. So it turns out that all change in biochemical systems, all change, whether you're talking about within a cell, as a cell communicates to its surroundings, whether you're talking about how cells cooperate to form tissues and organs, whether you talk about how organisms communicate with other organisms, any change is stress. And it turns out that whenever you're having that stress, one of the things that is done is we produce free radicals. Free radicals are highly reactive compounds. They basically have unpaired electrons, and electrons like to exist in pairs. So they're always looking to react with something. And they wind up reacting with everything. However, we'll see that they have a number of other important properties. So free radicals from a negative point of view are interacting and changing our DNA, our RNA, our proteins, our fats. That's bringing the system closer to equilibrium. But on the other hand, the system has evolved to sense those changes, which are telling the system, our collection of molecules, that we need to adjust what's there so that we can have a more harmonious flow. So the free radical damaged molecules are sensed by other molecules, in particular proteins, that have those allosteric properties that I mentioned, so that they will either turn on or turn off their activity and alter the limit cycles that are the homeostasis, really, of life. So molecular changes become communication that alter biochemical pathways in order to promote smooth flow in a more efficient exchange of nutrition and waste with the environment. So any disharmony on any scale, again, stress, produces free radicals. And we see that they promote degradation, but they are, as I just mentioned, also act as signals in order to reestablish more harmonious flow. On the other hand, we also use them as weapons. You know, nuclear energy makes free radicals. That's why nuclear energy, radiation can give you cancer, because it modifies your DNA, RNA, proteins, and lipids. So what we do in our immune system is we actually make free radicals that we use to nuke pathogens and cells that we need to kill, like cancer cells. However, as we make our equivalent to radiation, as we make that, we also have the unfortunate effect of collateral damage. You know, smart weapons are never quite smart enough. So these flow-dependent structures are dissipative structures. Well, what's flowing? Well, energy and mass. Well, how do we monitor what's flowing? It turns out your immune system monitors all mass that comes into the system. So whether you're eating food and your gut is loaded with your immune cells, most of the immune cells in your gut there, because that's where you're taking in outside material that can be very damaging and life-threatening. And on the other hand, your nervous system monitors all the energy that comes into the system, your sights, your sounds, your smells, your senses of touch, etc. And it's those two combinations that are our interface with our environment. And by them modulating what's coming in and how it's being used, they're trying to keep us alive and further from equilibrium. And we'll see that our endocannabinoid system has unique roles in the immune system and the nervous system, and in fact in all of our body systems. So I'm going to just show you a couple of examples here. In this case, apparent role of traveling metabolic waves and oxidant release by living neutrophils. Neutrophils are the foot soldiers of the immune system. When you have an infection, it's your neutrophils that go there rapidly. It's your neutrophils neutrophils that, by virtue of them producing free radicals, wind up dying earlier. You know, they're the infantrymen, essentially, sent out into the field to do battle. So what you're seeing here, that circle is an outline of a cell, of a neutrophil, and what you're seeing here is what's called autofluorescence, a chemical that gives off light when it's hit by a particular wavelength of light. And what you're seeing here is, over time, that collection, that high concentration of a particular molecule called NADPH, which is a high energy molecule because it's got that extra hydrogen added to it, forced onto it, you see that that concentration moves down the cell. And eventually what you're seeing here is like an explosion of light at the end of the cell. That's because there's another indicator, a chemical that's going to give us light in this case, that measures free radical production. This is another separate cell down there. So this cell here, at its head, basically, is releasing the free radicals. The energy came down the cell, reached the enzyme that was in the membrane of the cell, and then the cell is releasing free radicals basically to nuke pathogens. We're irradiating pathogens. Our bodies and these kinds of cells, not only do they make superoxide, which is what you're looking at here, but we actually make Clorox, and we also make hydrogen peroxide, both of which we know we use as disinfectants. Well, our bodies knew how to do that long before our brains figured it out. Here you're seeing another example of heterogeneity, organization, and I won't go into it in any detail, but what you're seeing here is reorganization of membranes of a cell. So that once again, we're seeing that there are multiple aspects of the physics that I mentioned earlier showing up in terms of organization subcellularly within our immune cells, because again, here we're looking at a neutrophil. So it turns out that things like insulin production are produced in a pulsate fashion. Oscillations, they're released in this pulsate fashion. So, and they're released in response to calcium. Calcium is a very critical molecule in all living systems. In general, whenever we activate anything, in this case, we're activating our endocrine system by producing insulin. If our muscles contract, we have calcium as the fundamental player there. Your neurotransmission, calcium again, in teaching cells to die appropriately, a process known as apoptosis. When you want a cancer cell to die, calcium is involved. So in general, all neurotransmission, immunological, muscular, all of the normal biological functions are critically regulated by calcium. That probably has a lot to do with the calcium carbonate, the limestone coming and going from the oceans as pH changes occurred, and those gradients creating those prebiotic organized structures that led to life. So here we see how cannabidiol affects mitochondria. Mitochondria are the energy-producing organelles within the cell, and calcium influxes when too high will cause cells to die. And here what we're seeing is how the oscillations that occur are dampened in neurons, in your hippocampal neurons, fundamentally involved in memory and a variety of other things, how cannabidiol is able to regulate those calcium oscillations. So now we've linked together the physics of life, oscillations, with energy production, and with cannabinoids, which is where I wanted to go. So now I want to look more specifically at the role of cannabinoids in aging. So it turns out the etiology of all age-related illnesses have free radical involvements. As we age, our weakest link breaks. So depending on your genetics and your life's history, the food you eat, the stresses you've been subjected to, those are all going to affect your free radical production and how eventually, because we're all going to die, the weakest link is going to break. So some people are predisposed to cardiovascular disease. Some people are predisposed to autoimmune disease, skeletal disorders, neurological disorders. So basically, free radicals are the friction of life. It turns out that our endocannabinoids are the oil of life. They lubricate our biochemistry to minimize the negative consequences of excess free radical production. What are the age-related illnesses? As organisms age, body systems move closer to equilibrium. And we have our circulatory system, our digestive system, our endocrine system, our immunological system, our musculoskeletal system, our nervous system. And I missed there what happened. I should have had also the reproductive system. So all of those body systems turn out to be regulated by endocannabinoids, and therefore by the plant as well, because that's the only thing that taps in so completely to the endocannabinoid system. Many of the herbs that people have used over the eons of our evolution affect the endocannabinoid system, the various flavonoids and other biologically relevant molecules are all part of how this flowing biochemistry either keeps us healthy or makes us sick. So the endocannabinoid system is uniquely suited to holistically modify the multidimensional interacting biochemical pathways that determine a system's health at any instant, as well as how it evolves over time. That's simple reality, you know? People may not like to hear that, but that is reality. I mean, everybody's at this conference, I know, knows this intuitively if you've used cannabis and benefited from it, either in terms of your, pleasure or in terms of your pain. The whole spectrum there is regulated by our cannabinoids. So here's a nice little proof of that essential role. What you're looking at here is what's called a survival curve. What percentage of an animal is living as a function of time? And what we're looking at here is what's called wild type. Because, we have copies of each gene, right? We have one from our mother, one from our father. We're looking at the CB1 receptor, which again is the most prevalent neurotransmitter system in your brain. And here we have one where you got one good copy and one bad copy. And you see that these mice are both living pretty, happily for 24 months. Whereas the ones who are what we call a double knockout, who do not have any CB1 receptor, these mice cannot get high. This is the ideal that our idiot governments would like us to be like. They want us to die young, die stupid. But we're going to not let that happen, are we? So here we have she was the oldest woman on the planet. She was 120 years old when this picture was taken. And you see she's smoking. And she says that the reason she lived so long was because she had ganja cigars and drank strong palm wine every day. She died at 125 years old. Well, it certainly didn't hurt her, did it? So the fact that our government has outlawed an anti-aging drug that kills cancer is proof of their incompetence. And what I'm going to do is elaborate on that further later on, where we see the fundamental role of cannabinoids, or the lack thereof, in creating that incompetence. So I want to go back now and look at cannabis and cancer, since that's certainly, I think, Rick's claim to fame, and what has really done such a tremendous job in spreading the word, because most cancer treatments are not effective. Certainly for the bulk of people, chemotherapy for the most part is who dies first, the cancer or the person. There are some success cases like childhood leukemia where it looks like 85 to 90% of those kids can be saved. On the other hand, many of them will come down with cancer 20 years ago because of the nasty nature of the chemotherapeutic drugs that are used to treat them. So we have autoimmune diseases. Something is screwed up there. I thought I had this all taken care of. What you're seeing here is a picture of my database. And what I want to do actually is go to that database for a second. Let me go back here. And this is my database. This is my brain, extension of my brain. And you can see that if we have no queries on it, I've got 20,000 articles here. And wherever you see one of those little paper clips, I actually have the article sitting here. So I can read, whoops, I screwed that one up. So I can read whatever I need to read. Because it's impossible to remember all of this stuff. But I have all of these articles here. So what we can do is we can look at cannabinoids. You know, we keep hearing we don't have enough science. What a crock of crap that is, you know, I'll tell you. So here, under cannabinoids, you see I have 13,000 articles. Now keep in mind that one of the major drugs that's used to treat HIV has a total of about 80 publications. Here we have cannabinoids. We've got thousands and thousands of publications, and the morons in our government and the bulk of our physicians, excluding the wonderful ones that we've had here today, don't even know that we have an endocannabinoid system, and I'll address that a little later. So we can now look at cannabinoids and cancer. And you see I've got 937 peer-reviewed articles, and I can tell you all except for maybe 5 articles show that cannabis inhibits cancer. Most of these, unfortunately, are only done in tissue culture, so you've got to be very careful of that. For example, a lot of the cancer-killing properties of CBD have only been demonstrated in tissue culture. So people who have made Rick Simpson extracts out of high CBD strains, from the anecdotal evidence that I've heard, and I could be wrong, because it is anecdotal at this point and very limited, high CBD extracts do not seem to be curing cancer, certainly not to the degree that THC-containing extracts do. But you can just, you know, any way you look here, you know, in this case it's CBD, towards the use of non-psychoactive cannabinoids in prostate cancer. But this was again done typically in tissue culture with different cell lines. So you don't have an immune system in tissue culture. And it turns out it's your immune system that is very critical in killing cancer cells. In general, I published a paper with a very brilliant friend a number of years ago that shows that you can divide all cancers, no matter if it's breast, colon, whatever, into 2 types. They are drug-resistant ones that kill you, or drug-sensitive ones that you can kill. And we'll go into that in a little while because there are some unique fundamental properties to those cancer cells that we can discuss. What I'm trying to do is to provide you with a comprehensive understanding of what is underlying the amazing properties of cannabis. So what are the body systems? Are autoimmune? Well, what are the different diseases? Autoimmune diseases, cardiovascular diseases. You know, here with respect to just looking up the cardiovascular system, we see that there are 194 articles showing various aspects of cannabinoids. Now, it turns out, and I'll go into this further, but it turns out that the CB1 receptor turns on sugar burning. And sugar burning can be very dangerous for cells, even though it's also absolutely necessary. For example, our nervous system, our brain cells, they die very easily. And they die because they undergo suicide, basically, free radical-induced cell death, called apoptosis. So it turns out that our nerve cells are very critically dependent on sugar burning, whereas if we look at some other cells, like our kidney or our heart, they're very much dependent on fat burning. And fat burning is a way that we've evolved to protect ourselves from making too many free radicals. You know, you want that heart to keep beating. That's the problem I've had. And it turns out that if you were to only stimulate things with CB1 receptor, there are a number of conditions where that can be problematic. For example, CB1 stimulation in the liver can promote fibrosis. as fibrosis can also occur in the lungs and other places in a CB1 dependent fashion. So a lot of the negative talk that you hear about cannabinoids is because they're not understanding the nature of life and the balancing acts that are occurring in terms of how our bodies produce antioxidants and go to a greater extent to protect ourselves by turning on fat burning. When you turn on fat burning, you protect cells from dying. They stop communicating with their environment, and what they do is they kind of purge themselves of their own problems. It's called autophagy, self-eating. So, for example, damaged mitochondria that could be identified by the free radical damage to the lipids that are composing the membranes would serve as a signal to eat up those mitochondria. So we basically eat ourselves, part of ourselves, under times of extreme damage to protect ourselves. That's why fasting is good. That's also why caloric restriction prolongs life so efficiently in the animal models that have been examined. There are some question with primates, but on the other hand, those primates were grown in isolated germ-free environments. So that's not realistic as well. So let's continue here. Our neurological disorders, we've mentioned strokes. Well, for example, in this case, CB1 receptor has a very unique role, because what it's doing by what's called retrograde transmission is that it feeds back to lower the calcium activation, and in doing so reduces the probability that the cell is going to become overactivated and basically cause apoptosis and cell death. And that can occur just by the fact that certain of the neurotransmitters, glutamate in particular, go by another name. They're called excitotoxins. So as we stimulate nerves with these excitotoxins, they have to be controlled so they don't kill themselves. And the way they're controlled is by the membrane of the receiving, the downstream neuron, is broken down on demand dictated by free radical production. And that breakdown, in turn, feeds backwards across the synaptic cleft, where it is received by cannabinoid receptors that in turn modulate calcium channels as well as other channels and decrease the probability of another transmission event and therefore protect the cells. So while the CB1 receptor turns on sugar burning, it does it in a fashion that tries to be protective. Why do I have this one up now? I forgot here. Let's see. This is just showing, the nervous system and cannabinoids. Now we have 830 articles on that, some of them by our beloved godfather of cannabinoid reality, Rafi Mechoulam. Again, we have plenty of science. We lack intelligent legislators, intelligent law enforcement members, people who are supposed to be able to investigate. Well, if I've got thousands of articles, how come they can't investigate and get beyond their fear of paranoia? We will address that later on. The skeletal system, it's the same thing. You know, much balance towards free radical producing chemistry causes basically deterioration, osteoporosis. But you have to create harmony, not stupidity. So, for example, some of the anti-osteoporotic drugs, when taken, what they did is they stopped the breakdown of the bone, which, from a superficial point of view, might sound like a good thing. But on the other hand, what you're doing is impairing flow, because you need balance of synthesis and degradation. What you want to do is not stop degradation. You want to enhance synthesis, change the balance. So as a result, some of those osteoporotic drugs, a woman would literally break her hip by stepping off the sidewalk because it promoted the formation of brittle bones. Cannabis would be a much better solution. So here we see cannabinoids, their role in regulating bone remodeling. The science is all there. Cancer, again, back to cancer. So again, we have these 917 articles. There are about 4 articles that show low doses of cancer can enhance breast cancer growth. that makes sense, because the low doses are going to predominantly be turning on sugar burning. And if you have a cancer that is sugar burning dependent, well, then you're going to facilitate it. So now I'm going to show you some pretty dramatic pictures here of topical application for squamous cell. This is a woman in Australia. You know, people in Australia, you had all these fair-skinned limeys leaving the London fog, the protection of the London fog, and going to Australia and the equatorial sun. As a consequence, 70% of people over 70 in Australia have had or have skin cancer. So this woman here had a basal cell, a squamous cell rather, in her arm, and this is right after she started to apply cannabis. And after a few weeks, what the body did was it actually expelled cancer. And it took 3 months of progressive destruction of that cancer, and it was quite painful. Here what you see, you know, we would cover it up at night with some saran wrap, because anybody who's used Rick Simpson oils knows what a sticky mess it is. And when she lifted off the saran wrap in the morning, 30% of the tumor fell off with it. And over time, the wound healed up, continues to get better, and in the end, it was completely normal, and this has been biopsied, and she is free of skin cancer, just by a topical application. Now I'm going to show you some very dramatic pictures. That wasn't dramatic enough. This poor man had what his doctors called the worst case of squamous cell carcinoma they had ever seen. He was fair-skinned. He lived in Australia and Hawaii. The tumor that you're seeing on his head extended over 2 inches above the top of his head, and those holes went right down to his skull and would fill up with disgusting smelling fluid. This is what conventional medicine had to do. This is, in my mind, an example of total insanity. He received 135 radiation treatments. Tumors like this, which are obviously radiation resistant after 135 irradiations, remember, these are the fat-burning tumor cells. When you treat them, what happens is they actually wind up growing. So we put cannabis on there topically, and just as you saw in the woman's arm, it started to bring out the cancer. It brought out another one over here. So he kept applying this, and eventually started to take it internally, and eventually found an oncologist who was willing to at least listen to him. He went through so many oncologists, they didn't want to hear about this. Narrow-minded morons. That he found a good one, finally said, put this all over your head because we don't know where the cancer is. And the next picture, that's what happened. It ate, what you're seeing here is it ate the cancer right down to the bone. Now, unfortunately, this guy's head was open like that for a year, and he never had an infection because of all the extract that he was eating, as well as putting it on topically, because it was giving him pain relief, and all the other skin cancers that he had on his body, all the basal cells that he had on his arms and his chest, they fell off. But this one here was obviously quite a case. Unfortunately, because of another condition, he wound up going to the hospital, where he got a drug-resistant infection. They then gave him an antibiotic to which he was allergic, and he would tell me, Bob, you got to get me out of here, they're killing me. In fact, they succeeded, they killed him. So, ignorance is not bliss. And the problem that we have is that we do not teach the endocannabinoid system in our medical schools. So this survey was done last summer, and they found that 13% of the medical schools in the United States, there are 156 of them, I think, mention the word endocannabinoid. Mention the word. Now, the major neurotransmitter system in your brain, and they're mentioning the word. Wow. Hopefully this is changing. But how can we expect our doctors, who are educating our politicians and our policymakers to have any intelligence in what they're saying when they don't have a clue about what's going on. So we have idiot politicians listening to uneducated doctors making ridiculous laws that are killing people. So this just reiterates what I was saying. Purpose of the study was to point out the absurdity of ignoring a new science. We would hope this case study medical schools to rethink their position and welcome this new science. We call on deans of all medical schools to start organizing courses in cannabinoid receptor science and its modulation effects on homeostasis. If the medical schools in your state do not teach endocannabinoid science, you can discuss ways to incorporate the study into the endocannabinoid system into their curriculum. Well, again, if you don't understand the physics that I presented at the beginning of this, then you don't understand the homeostatic nature of life and the unique role that the cannabinoids play in modulating it. So here we have an example of an intelligent doctor who looked at some of the science. I sent him hundreds and hundreds of references. He, in fact, filmed me for 3 days. They chose the story of the little girl with Dravet syndrome, which was, I think, a much wiser approach. But he came out and apologized to the people because he realized that he had been uneducated, and now he learned something new. He was open-minded enough to learn something new, and that's something we're going to discuss in a moment as well. So here we have, as was mentioned in an earlier talk, Charlotte Beachy, who went from having hundreds of grand mal seizures a day, she suffers from Dravet syndrome, to having virtually none. There are many other children like that. We have had over 200 families moving to Vermont to escape the fascism of their own state, where the state insists on killing their children or having their children suffer seizures. And even on the latest show from Sanjay Gupta, we had a neurologist. His concern was we don't know what's going on with CBD-rich oil. Well, what's your alternative? A few hundred seizures a day, and you're concerned about what CBD might be doing? That's stupidity. Is the endocannabinoid system responsible for the evolution of human intelligence? Is the endocannabinoid system an evolutionary tool to create and then rebalance excess flow? Well, think about it. It creates excess flow because what does it do? It makes you hungry. So you're going to eat more. And if you eat more and you don't do it intelligently, then your body has to protect itself from your gluttony, and it does that by making fat, because then you're not burning all that sugar. So it's a whole story again of, remember, the limits, the balancing. Oh, God. Some idiot's calling me. So free radicals, we need a balance. Free radicals minimizing harm. And again, cannabinoids are your oil of life to help protect you from the friction of life. So are the current biochemical thermostats correctly set? Because we're evolving. And what we let me go into a whole interesting story here. So original life was photosynthetic and chemosynthetic bacteria and algae-like creatures, right? After 1 billion years, they changed the planet. The atmosphere was a reducing atmosphere with reducing compounds, no oxygen. But these photosynthetic and chemosynthetic organisms made oxygen for 1 billion years as they died. So now you had a new potential. You had oxygen that could burn, 1 billion years of corpses, organic material. And that led to the next jump because of increased flow that led to the formation of eukaryotic organisms, the kinds of cells that make us up. And what we saw is the original protozoa, they have the biochemistry of endocannabinoids. They make anandamide, for example, but they do not have cannabinoid receptors. So then eventually cells started to cooperate with one another, and you had the most primitive multicellular organisms, the porifera, the sponges. They had very limited differentiation, but you can see you're going to have an outside and an inside So already you're going to create differences. So the next step was the ball of cells that formed sponges formed a little indent. And that indent was both an anus and a mouth. Well, that anus and a mouth eventually turned into the tube that runs through organisms that have a digestive system, with an anus and a mouth on opposite ends. So the original organisms that developed that quality are called proteostomes, and they are formed head first. In contrast, a new line of organisms evolved, and those are the vertebrates. And it was with the development of the vertebrates that we first had the cannabinoid receptors appear. Now remember, the cannabinoid receptors are regulating every body system that we have. You didn't have that level of regulation prior to that when you only had the proteostomes. The vertebrates are the deuterostomes. We are formed but first in terms of the opening, the hole that goes through us and forms the tube. Whereas the proteostomes, the insects and the crustaceans, are formed head first. Think of the society of ants or bees. They have a very rigid, structured society. They've never made iPhones. They are very hardwired. What Newton said, not Newton, what Darwin said was the basis for survival of the fittest was not intelligence and it was not strength. It was adaptability. So look what happened. We had the evolution of a whole new lineage that for the first time in the history of life had endocannabinoid receptors, and those endocannabinoid receptors wound up regulating everything. So first we only had a CB1 receptor, and then we evolved a CB2 receptor. Now again, the CB1 receptor regulates fat burning, the CB2 receptor regulates, CB1 regulates sugar burning, the CB2 regulates fat burning. So we now had a way of dealing with increased flow without killing ourselves with free radicals. Now, in terms of aging, what we've seen, well, in terms of evolution, what we've seen is a continuous increase in the endocannabinoid system and its activity. I don't know what happened then. Have things going crazy? Am I functional or not? I don't know. I cannot tell what's going on while I'm in this program here. I'm going to try to find out by looking at my iPhone and seeing if I can see what's going on. In any event, 100 years ago, people in America in particular, industrialized, pre-industrial societies, we lived to 40, 50 years old, and the major cause of death was infections. And in general, we fight infections via inflammation. As I showed you earlier, we make free radicals to try and kill pathogens. However, as we got cleaner and smarter, we no longer have sewers running down our streets. We have good nutrition year-round, even though a lot of it's garbagey. You can get good food. And we have antibiotics, which are among the really good medicines that have developed. Many, many lives are saved, and thankfully now we're no longer going to feed it to our cattle and make them fat. So as a result, we're living longer. And modern man today, we're dying dominantly from age-related illnesses, no longer infections. That's not what's killing people in America, for example. It's heart disease and cancer and autoimmune disease and Alzheimer's, all of which are inhibited by cannabinoids. So essentially what we need to do is what we've always done, and by we I mean life. We have to continue to increase our cannabinoid activity. But we no longer have to wait for evolution to do it, because remember, we have the brain that's monitoring what's coming into our system. We can now become more consistent with the evolutionary processes that have created us by being smart enough to consume more cannabinoids. Now, every doctor in this country or in the world, for the most part, is going to tell you fish oil and omega-3 fatty acids are good for you. What the bulk of them do not know, and thankfully more and more of the medical marijuana community does know, because we're better educated than the doctors, is that omega-3 fatty acids, omega-6 fatty acids are turned into endocannabinoids. That's why they protect your heart. That's why they protect your brain. That's why they have pain-relieving properties. That's why they have antidepressive properties. They work because they increase your cannabinoid activity. So why should we fight it? We need more cannabinoid activity. It's a necessary, essential nutrient for modern man. So it turns out that an intrinsic truth is that for any parameter that you look at, half the people are going to be above average and half the people are going to be below average. So let's look at the consequence of that when we're dealing with cannabinoid activity and how it affects your brain. So the people who are what I call blips, backward-looking people, are the people who are cannabinoid deficient in terms of open-mindedness. They're closed-minded because cannabis allows people, your cannabinoids as well, your endos and phyto, plant cannabinoids, they allow us to embrace change because we are more open-minded. Whereas the backward-looking people are stressed by change, the blips versus the flips. Backward-looking people don't have enough cannabinoid activity, so when they experience change, the stress is all they feel. Whereas when cannabinoid-endowed people experience stress, one of the known features, so to speak, of cannabis users is optimism. Well, what does optimism mean? It means you look into the future, you don't know what it holds, but you're confident that you will adapt. Adaptability, back to Darwin again. Why? Because we have sufficient endocannabinoid activity, or we know how to enhance it with phytocannabinoids. So what we need now is, what are the consequences of blips versus flips? Well, it's my contention that the world is run by cannabinoid deficient blips. They're angry, they're uptight, they're fearful, they're hostile, and they want to maintain things in the status quo always because they don't have enough cannabinoid activity to be open-minded. All they can do is be subject to their own fear. Now here's an experiment that basically supports what I'm telling you. This a thing called the Morris water maze. What it is a big tub of water, cloudy water, and if you put mice into it, the mice swim around and freak out. And if you put a platform in there, they will eventually find the platform, and then as soon as you put them in, they go to the platform. So you can do that with the wild type normal mice that can't get high, or you can do it with the knockout mice that I showed you die prematurely. And the knockout mice, in both cases, the mice are able to find the platform, and they're able to remember where the platform is. But now you change the position of the platform. You take the wild-type mice, they go in there, they freak out because the platform's not where they expected it to be. They swim around, explore. They eventually find the platform. If you take the mice out and put them back in again, they go right to the platform. So they replace their old information with new, updated information. In contrast, if you take the double knockouts that can't get high at all and are highly stressed, and you put them in after you change the position of the platform, they swim around, they find where the platform is, you take them out, you put them in, they go to the old place, not the new place. They were not able to forget, they're hardwired, they don't have open minds. So there are a lot of consequences to this. You know, just think back in terms of the leaders of humanity over time. You know, we've had Genghis Khan, we've had, you know, Mao Zedong, we've had Adolf Hitler, we've had all of the crazy presidents that are ready, like George Bush, to invade this country or that country for whatever reason, money or ideology. How many good people have run countries? We've had Nelson Mandela, and we've had Gandhi, How many others? The world has been run by blips, the backward-looking, unhigh people. Now, there are big consequences to this because man is having a tremendous impact on our environment. And if mankind is to survive, remember, most species that have ever lived on this planet have gone extinct. And we're heading that way right now because we are ignoring the impact we are having on our environment. And remember, it's the flow from our environment that sustains all life. So if we don't get rid of the narrow-minded, uptight morons that would rather spend money on weapons than on improving humanity and improving our environment, we will go extinct. So for the very survival of mankind, we need to increase the cannabinoid activity in the human population. And we need to do it quick, not by waiting for evolution. And that's why the revolution is happening and cannabinoids are being demanded around the world. And Rick Simpson, certainly we all owe a gratitude to, because not only is he helping us with cancer and all the other diseases, the spreading of this knowledge is actually going to help mankind survive and have the revolution that we need. And when I say revolution, it's just another phase change. Think of what happened when the Berlin Wall fell. It wasn't an organized revolt. The collective consciousness of the people finally said, we're done with this. We're not playing this insane game anymore. And that's what that's what's happening now. Colorado, the people voted for medical marijuana first, and then they voted for legal marijuana. It's so wonderful to be able to go into a store and buy it. It's still not as open as it should be. We've got all sorts of lawsuits going against the mayor, the prosecutors in town here, where they tried to put, a cancer patient in jail because he had too many plants, where they've attacked the store because they didn't like them. Things are going to change because they can't afford the lawsuits, and they're going to lose because they've been wrong, not righteous, uptight flips. So if we want to live longer, we need to consume more cannabis. And to show how totally insane it is, psychoactive cannabinoids are found in mother's milk. Why? Think about it. While the fetus was developing, it was getting its oxygen from the placenta. And the level of oxygen coming across was lower than when you're breathing. And when a child is first born, it's breathing in that higher level of oxygen. Now, to show how significant that could be, at one point they tried to treat premature babies who have immature respiratory systems by giving them oxygen. The consequence was that those newborns went blind. Just giving them oxygen made them blind. So here the infant comes out, it's going, especially like with a first child, it might be 20 hours of contractions and childbirth. The kid's head is all squished. It's got to be a traumatic event. So it comes out, you nurse him, you give him a little bit of a buzz, the kid relaxes, and the kid starts to get hungry. If you inhibit the CB1 receptor, like with rimonabant that inhibits the CB1 receptor, then newborn mice die. It was back in, Patients Out of Time conference when they first were doing the rimonabant. They were trying to use it to inhibit metabolic syndrome because they wanted to inhibit your appetite. At a talk I gave, I said, this is ridiculous. You're going to eliminate all of these good properties of cannabinoids. Well, what happened is in the U.S., the FDA never approved it, but it was approved in Europe. And after 2 years, they took it off the market because people were committing suicide. You made them so unhigh that they were killing themselves. So I think that one of the problems potentially, and this is total speculation, but it's fun, is that a lot of our government people are people who were never nursed. What they're suffering from is post-birth traumatic stress disorder. Now, just think about it. Should we be arresting nursing mothers because they're getting their children high? Maybe we should just arrest all women for walking around with paraphernalia. So we've got to do something about these blips and flips. Here we clearly have a blip, a backward-looking, angry, uptight moron, as opposed to a flip. Who do we want running the world? Here we have another example. blocking the postpartum mouse dam CB1 receptors impairs maternal behavior as well as offspring development and their adult social emotional behavior. You know, I've got 4 children and 5 grandchildren, and I can tell you we all made sure that they were nursed properly and got their endocannabinoid activity at an early age. They're all taking fish oil. They're all smart. They range from 9 years old to 43 years old. And they're all successful. Whether they use cannabis or not, that's for them to say. But I can tell you that I've been using cannabis for 50 years. I'm 66 years old, and I'm so thankful for all the pot I've used. You know, and again, to show the political influence of cannabinoid systems. Here, political attitudes vary with physiological traits. In a group of 46 adult participants with strong political beliefs, individuals with measurably lower physical sensitivities to sudden noises and threatening images were more likely to support foreign aid, liberal immigration policies, pacifism, and gun control. The mellow people. Whereas individuals displaying a higher physiological reaction to these same stimuli were more likely to favor defense spending, capital punishment, patriotism in the Iraq War. Well, what are we dealing with? Cannabinoid deficient versus cannabinoid sufficient people. It's the same story of blips and flips. Here's another one. Neurocognitive correlates of liberalism and conservatism. They found that greater liberalism was associated with stronger conflict-related anterior cingulate activity, whereas greater neurocognitive sensitivity to cues for altering a habitual behavioral response. Well, that area of the brain is loaded with cannabinoid receptors. So do we want people who are uptight and angry running the world, or do we want people who can, you know, figure out alternative ways of dealing with conflict? The survival of an individual as well as the survival of the species may depend on replacing blips and flips. I would eliminate the may, and I would say does. What kind of world do we want to live in? To me, the choice is obvious. This is a picture of one of the big grows here in Colorado. This is only one of many channels in this 43,000 square foot grow. They're able to produce 500 pounds of bud a month. Current marijuana policies are inhuman. They are based on fear, ignorance, and greed. We're really dealing with racism because it's the people who are cannabinoid deficient that are willing to put people in jail who are cannabinoid sufficient. And we see that in particular with the attack on people of color, of minorities, by the uptight white morons that are making these ridiculous laws. We've got to make a change, and we've got to make it now. Thank you for your time.
Takole. Torej smo zaključili, mislim pa, da lahko damo še en velik aplaus. One big applause for Mr. Dr. Robert J. Melamede. Now we can actually say to you, what was that laughter that you heard before? When we read, we must consume more cannabis, we were so delighted by the message. So thank you.